What if I told you that a president kept a 1,400-pound wheel of cheese in the White House foyer for over a year? That another spent his mornings swimming naked in the Potomac River? That one talked to portraits late at night like they could actually answer back? You know, the big moments, the declarations, the wars, the speeches that change history. But presidential history is also filled with private rituals, strange habits, coping mechanisms that help these men survive the weight of leading a nation. Things they did when no one was watching, things that never made it into your textbook, but tell you more about who they actually were than any monument ever could. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to explore 13 strange things US presidents did in private. Not myths, not legends, just verified, documented facts about how these leaders managed the loneliness, the pressure, and the impossible burden of the office. So, if you're enjoying this journey through the weird side of presidential history, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Get comfortable, pull up those blankets, and let's talk about the oddly human moments behind the marble statues, starting with a man who believed his morning swim routine was the secret to staying disciplined. John Quincy Adams, skinny dipped before work. So, here's the thing about John Quincy Adams, the sixth president of the United States, son of a founding father, diplomat, senator, all around overachiever. You'd think a man like that would start his day with tea and correspondence, maybe a brisk walk around the grounds in a powdered wig or whatever passed for business casual in 1825. But no. John Quincy Adams started most mornings by stripping down to absolutely nothing and diving into the Potomac River like it was a community pool in July. And we're not talking about a quick dip. This was a ritual, a commitment. Adams would wake up before dawn, walk down to the river, shed every stitch of clothing, and swim, sometimes for an hour, in a river that, depending on the season, ranged from refreshingly cool to hypothermia inducing. He did this because he believed it kept him healthy, disciplined, sharp, which fair enough, but also imagine being a federal employee in 1828, rowing past the White House at 5:30 in the morning, and suddenly you're making unintentional eye contact with the leader of the free world doing the breaststroke in his birthday suit. Adams wasn't shy about it either. This wasn't some secret indulgence he hid from the public. People knew, his staff knew, visitors to Washington knew. There are accounts of him swimming while his aide sat on the riverbank, guarding his clothes like some kind of presidential lifeguard. One famous story involves a journalist named Anne Royal who wanted an interview. Adams kept refusing. So she allegedly went down to the river one morning, sat on his clothes, and told him she wasn't moving until he answered her questions. And according to the story, he did. From the water, still naked. Because what else are you going to do at that point? Swim to Maryland? Now, whether that exact scenario happened is debated among historians, but the fact that it's even plausible tells you everything you need to know about Adams's morning routine. The man was committed. Rain, shine, political crisis, didn't matter. He treated that river like his personal gym membership, except instead of canceling after 2 months like the rest of us, he kept it up for years. It wasn't about vanity or showmanship. Adams genuinely believed physical discipline translated to mental clarity. He was one of those people who thought suffering a little bit every day made you better at your job, which is either inspirational or exhausting depending on how much sleep you got last night. And look, this wasn't just about health. Adams was dealing with a lot. His presidency was rough. He barely won the election in 1824, and a huge chunk of the country thought it was stolen. His opponents called him corrupt. His policies were blocked left and right. He had a Congress that hated him and a public that was, at best, ambivalent. So every morning, before he had to go deal with all of that, he'd get in the river and swim. Alone. in silence, with nothing between him and the cold water except his own thoughts and maybe a very confused fish or two. There's something oddly relatable about it, honestly. The idea that this man, who spent his entire life in public service, whose father helped create the country, who spoke something like 7 languages and spent decades in diplomacy, still needed to carve out a weird little private ritual just to cope with the stress of existence. He couldn't control Congress. He couldn't control the newspapers. But he could control whether or not he got in that river. And so he did, every single day. And here's the kicker. Adams lived to be 80, outlived most of his contemporaries, stayed sharp and active well into old age. So maybe he was onto something. Maybe the secret to a long life isn't green juice or yoga. Maybe it's just finding a river, taking off your pants, and refusing to care what anyone thinks about it. Of course, if you tried that today, you'd probably end up on the news for all the wrong reasons. But in 1825, it was just Tuesday for John Quincy Adams, a man who believed that discipline, health, and a freezing cold river were the only things standing between him and complete chaos. And honestly, he might have been right. But of course, Adams wasn't the only president with a strange relationship with the physical world. Some took discipline in different directions. Some didn't take it at all. And at least one of them decided that the best way to handle the pressures of office was to invite a 1,400-pound wheel of cheese into his house and just leave it there. Andrew Jackson kept a 400-pound cheese wheel. Andrew Jackson was a lot of things. War hero, duelist, the kind of man who would absolutely fight you in a Denny's parking lot at 2 a.m. and probably win. But he was also, and this is important, a man who kept a 1,400-pound wheel of cheese in the White House foyer for over a year, just sitting there, aging, slowly becoming sentient for all we know. Let's back up. It's 1835. Jackson is in his second term. He's controversial, he's combative, and he's somehow managed to make a lot of enemies and a lot of very enthusiastic fans at the same time. One of those fans was a dairy farmer from New York named Thomas Meacham, who decided the best way to show his support for the president was to create the world's largest wheel of cheddar cheese and send it to him as a gift. Because apparently in the 1830s, that was a normal thing to do. The cheese was massive, 4 feet in diameter, 2 feet thick, 1,400 pounds of dairy, wrapped up and shipped to Washington like some kind of cursed artifact. And Jackson, instead of politely declining or donating it to a soup kitchen or literally anything else, just accepted it. He had it placed in the entrance hall of the White House, the foyer, the first thing you'd see when you walked in. Not a painting, not a statue, a wheel of cheese the size of a small car, and then he just left it there for over a year. It sat in the White House, slowly ripening, while Jackson went about his business. Visitors would come in expecting to discuss policy or shake the president's hand, and instead they'd be greeted by this enormous, pungent wheel of cheddar just chilling in the corner like it paid rent. You have to imagine the smell. Cheese that size doesn't just sit quietly. It announces itself. It has opinions. And those opinions were probably getting stronger by the day. Now, Jackson wasn't planning to eat it himself. That would have taken years, possibly decades. He was waiting, biding his time. And then, in 1837, just before he left office, he threw a massive party, opened the White House doors to the public. Thousands of people showed up, and Jackson, in a move that can only be described as either extremely generous or mildly unhinged, served the entire wheel of cheese to the crowd. Gone in 2 hours, 1,400 pounds of aged cheddar devoured by a mob of citizens who probably hadn't eaten that well in months. The White House smelled like cheese for weeks afterward. The carpets were ruined. There were crumbs everywhere. It was chaos. Beautiful, dairy-fueled chaos. And Jackson loved it. He saw it as a symbol of democracy, the people's cheese, a giant, smelly monument to the idea that the White House belonged to everyone, not just the elites, which is a nice sentiment, even if it did make the building smell like a Wisconsin gas station for the rest of the winter. But here's the thing. This wasn't just a publicity stunt. Jackson genuinely believed in this kind of thing. He was the first president to really embrace the idea of populism. The notion that the government should be accessible, even messy, even a little bit ridiculous. He didn't care about decorum. He didn't care that the White House was supposed to be dignified. He cared about making a point. And if that point involved a 1,400-pound wheel of cheese turning the presidential residence into the world's largest fondue party, then so be it. And people remembered it. For years afterward, political cartoons referenced the cheese. Opponents mocked him for it. Supporters loved him for it. It became part of his legacy, right alongside the whole war hero who fought in duels thing. Andrew Jackson, the man who kept a cheese wheel in his house and then fed it to an entire city. You have to admire the commitment, honestly. Most of us can't even finish a block of cheddar before it gets moldy in the fridge. Jackson kept one the size of a coffee table for a year and then threw a party around it. That's not just eccentricity. That's performance art. But Jackson wasn't the only president who found comfort in unusual objects. Some took it even further, talking to things that definitely couldn't talk back. And at least one of them did it on a daily basis, with a straight face like it was the most normal thing in the world. Calvin Coolidge talked to inanimate objects. Calvin Coolidge was known as Silent Cal, the 30th president of the United States. A man so famously quiet that when he died, Dorothy Parker allegedly said, "How could they tell?" Which is harsh, but also kind of accurate. Coolidge didn't talk much in public. He didn't give long speeches. He didn't engage in small talk at parties. He was the human equivalent of a library during finals week. Calm, reserved, present, but only technically. But here's what people didn't see. When Coolidge was alone, he talked, just not to people. He talked to objects, specifically rubber animals, toy figurines, things sitting on his desk that absolutely, definitively could not respond. And he did this regularly, casually, like it was the most reasonable way to spend an afternoon in the Oval Office. Now, we're not talking about full conversations. Coolidge wasn't having philosophical debates with a rubber duck about fiscal policy. It was more like acknowledgments, brief comments, little observations directed at inanimate things that happened to be nearby. He'd look at a toy horse and say something. He'd address a paperweight. He'd make a remark to a statue like it had just walked in and asked him a question. And then he'd go back to work as if nothing unusual had happened. This wasn't a secret either. People who worked with him noticed. His staff saw it. His wife, Grace Coolidge, definitely knew. But nobody made a big deal out of it because, honestly, what were they going to say? "Mr. President, we're concerned about your relationship with that ceramic frog." It wasn't hurting anyone. It wasn't affecting his job. It was just Coolidge being Coolidge. A man who found more comfort in silence and the occasional one-sided chat with a desktop ornament than in the endless socializing that came with being president. And you have to understand, Coolidge didn't want to be president. Not really. He became vice president under Warren G. Harding. And when Harding died suddenly in 1923, Coolidge was on vacation at his father's house in Vermont. No electricity, no phone. A messenger had to drive up in the middle of the night to tell him he was now the leader of the country. His father, a notary public, swore him in by lamplight in the family living room at 2:47 in the morning. And just like that, Silent Cal was president. No campaign, no warning, just a quiet man from Vermont suddenly responsible for an entire nation. He didn't love it. He was good at the job by most accounts. Steady, hit, competent. He believed in small government and letting things run themselves, which meant he spent a lot of time not doing much at all, which people either loved or hated depending on their political leanings. But he didn't enjoy the performance of it. The dinners, the handshaking, the constant need to be on. Coolidge was an introvert in a job designed for extroverts, and it wore on him. So he found ways to cope. And one of those ways apparently was talking to things that couldn't talk back. It makes a weird kind of sense, honestly. If you're someone who finds human interaction exhausting, but you still need to externalize thoughts occasionally, why not direct them at a rubber chicken? It's not going to argue with you. It's not going to leak your comments to the press. It's not going to ask follow-up questions or demand your attention. It's just there, silent. Judgmental maybe, but in a way you can ignore. There's also something almost meditative about it. Coolidge was known for taking long naps in the middle of the day. Sometimes 2 or 3 hours. He'd disappear into his private quarters and just sleep, which his critics loved to mock, but which was probably one of the smartest things he did. The man understood rest. He understood boundaries. And he understood that sometimes, in order to function in a role that demands everything from you, you need little pockets of weirdness that belong only to you. Talking to inanimate objects was his version of that. A tiny rebellion against the constant noise of politics. A way to hear his own voice without the pressure of conversation. He could say something, hear it out loud, and move on. No response required. No judgment. Just a brief moment of sound in an otherwise quiet room, shared with a desk toy that had no opinion on tariffs or foreign policy. The tragedy underneath all of this, though, was real. In 1924, Coolidge's youngest son, Calvin Jr., died from an infected blister he got playing tennis on the White House courts. He was 16. The infection turned to sepsis before antibiotics existed to treat it. And Coolidge, who was already a quiet man, became even quieter after that. He withdrew. He lost interest in the presidency. He once said that when his son died, the power and glory of the presidency went with him. After that loss, those moments with the rubber animals probably meant something different. They weren't just quirky habits anymore. They were lifelines. Small anchors to normalcy in a world that had become unbearable. A way to speak without having to explain the grief that sat in his chest like a stone. The objects didn't judge. They didn't offer condolences he didn't want. They just existed, silent and unchanging, in a life that had shifted too suddenly and too cruelly. And honestly, there's something deeply human about that. We all have our little quirks. The things we do when no one's watching that would seem bizarre if anyone ever found out. Coolidge's just happened to involve rubber animals and the occasional muttered observation. He wasn't losing his mind. He was managing it. One weird, quiet moment at a time. In a role that took almost everything from him, these small conversations with objects that couldn't respond became a way to hold on to himself. Of course, not every president handled stress with silence. Some went the opposite direction. Some needed movement, physical exertion, the kind of activity that reminded them they were alive and capable of breaking things if necessary. And at least one of them took that philosophy so seriously, he turned the White House into a boxing ring. Theodore Roosevelt boxed staffers inside the White House. Theodore Roosevelt did not know how to relax. The 26th President of the United States, conservationist, author, big game hunter. The man who once gave a speech with a bullet lodged in his chest because he figured he'd finish talking before he died. Roosevelt operated at one speed, maximum. And when he became president in 1901, after William McKinley was assassinated, he brought that energy directly into the White House, which meant that if you worked for him, there was a non-zero chance you'd end up getting punched in the face before lunch. Roosevelt boxed regularly, not as a hobby, not occasionally. This was part of his routine. He had a boxing area set up in the White House, and he'd invite aides, military officers, friends, anyone willing and moderately athletic to spar with him. And these weren't light, friendly matches. Roosevelt boxed hard. He wanted a real workout. He wanted to sweat. He wanted to feel like he'd been in a fight, even if it was technically just exercise. And people obliged. Partly because he was the president, and you don't really say no to that. But also because Roosevelt had this way of making everything seem exciting. He was enthusiastic, charismatic. He made boxing in the White House sound like the most natural thing in the world. Like, of course, you'd want to spend your afternoon getting hit in the ribs by the commander-in-chief. Why wouldn't you? What else were you going to do, paperwork? He sparred with professional boxers, amateur fighters, military officers, cabinet members who probably just wanted to discuss budget allocations, but instead found themselves dodging jabs in what was supposed to be a meeting room. Roosevelt didn't discriminate. If you were there and you looked like you could throw a punch, you were a potential sparring partner. The White House became less of a government building and more of a gym where occasionally some governing happened between rounds. But here's where it gets darker. Roosevelt didn't stop even when he should have. In 1908, during a sparring session with a young military aide, he took a hard punch to the left eye. It didn't seem like a big deal at first. Just part of the game. A hazard of the sport. Roosevelt shook it off and kept going because that's what Roosevelt did. He didn't acknowledge pain, didn't acknowledge limits, didn't acknowledge that maybe getting repeatedly punched in the face at age 50 wasn't the best life choice. But over time, he started losing vision in that eye. Slowly at first, then more significantly. Colors faded, details blurred. By the time he realized how serious it was, the damage was permanent. A detached retina. He was blind in his left eye for the rest of his life. And did he stop boxing? No, of course not. He just switched to jiu-jitsu. Because if you're Theodore Roosevelt and you can't punch people anymore, you simply find a different way to throw them on the ground. He brought in instructors, he practiced grappling, he learned throws and holds and submissions. He kept up the physical routines because for him, sitting still wasn't an option. Exercise wasn't just a way to stay healthy. It was how he processed stress, how he dealt with the constant pressure of leading a country, how he reminded himself he was still the same man who'd charged up San Juan Hill and hunted grizzly bears and refused to let anything, including his own body, slow him down. Roosevelt believed in what he called the strenuous life, the idea that comfort made you weak, that you needed to push yourself physically and mentally in order to be worth anything. It was part philosophy, part coping mechanism, part genuine belief that suffering a little bit every day made you better. And he lived it. He boxed, he hiked, he swam in the Potomac in winter, which apparently was just something presidents did back then. He climbed rocks, he rode horses. He did all of this while also running the country, writing books, and raising 6 children who were, by all accounts, as chaotic as he was. His kids famously turned the White House into a zoo. Literally, they had ponies, snakes, a badger, a bear. Roosevelt didn't just allow this, he encouraged it. He believed childhood should be wild and loud and slightly dangerous, probably because that's how he lived his entire adult life. The White House during his tenure wasn't a dignified, quiet place. It was loud, active, slightly unhinged. There were wrestling matches in the hallways, pillow fights, impromptu boxing lessons. It was less like a government building and more like a very expensive summer camp where one of the counselors happened to be president. And Roosevelt loved it. He thrived in chaos. He needed it. Sitting behind a desk all day would have killed him faster than any bullet. So he boxed. He grappled. He sparred with anyone willing to step into the ring with him, knowing full well he might lose an eye in the process. And when he did lose that eye, he just kept going. Because stopping wasn't in his vocabulary. There's something almost tragic about it, though. The man couldn't slow down, even when his body started breaking, even when he lost vision, even when he probably should have taken a step back. He couldn't. He was terrified of stillness, of becoming soft, of losing the thing that made him feel alive. And so he kept fighting, kept moving, kept boxing invisible opponents long after the physical ones were gone. But not every president dealt with pressure through movement. Some went the opposite direction. Some retreated inward, found solitude, spent their nights alone with their thoughts, waiting for information that might never come, trying to make sense of a war they couldn't control. Abraham Lincoln spent nights in the telegraph office. Abraham Lincoln didn't sleep much during the Civil War, which makes sense when you think about it. The country was literally tearing itself apart. Hundreds of thousands of people were dying. Every decision he made could save lives or end them. Sleep probably felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. So instead of lying in bed staring at the ceiling, Lincoln would walk across the White House grounds to the War Department, where the telegraph office was located, and just sit there for hours, reading updates from the battlefield, waiting for news that might change everything or confirm his worst fears. This wasn't occasional. This was almost nightly. Lincoln treated the telegraph office like his own private newsroom, a place where information came in raw and unfiltered, before anyone could spin it or soften it or tell him what he wanted to hear. He'd arrive late in the evening, sometimes after midnight, and sit with the telegraph operators while they decoded messages from generals in the field, messages about troop movements, casualty numbers, victories that weren't really victories, defeats that were somehow worse than expected. The operators got used to him. They'd see the tall, gaunt figure walking through the door, and they'd know he wasn't leaving anytime soon. Lincoln would pull up a chair, sometimes read the messages himself, sometimes wait for them to be handed to him. He didn't make small talk. He didn't demand updates every 5 minutes. He just sat, present, patient, a man trying to understand a war in real time, one telegram at a time. And the thing is, Lincoln didn't have to be there. He could have waited in the White House, could have had messages delivered to him, could have gotten summaries in the morning like a normal person, but he didn't trust summaries. He didn't trust secondhand information. He wanted the raw data, the unedited truth. Because in a war where everyone was lying to themselves about how bad things were, the telegraph was the closest thing to honesty he could find. There's something almost obsessive about it. The way he'd sit there, night after night, reading reports that were often just lists of the dead. The way he'd process each piece of information, like it was a puzzle he could solve if he just stared at it long enough. Lincoln was a man who believed in logic, in reason, in the idea that if you gathered enough facts, you could find a solution. But the Civil War wasn't a puzzle. It was chaos. and no amount of sitting in a telegraph office was going to change that. But he kept going anyway, partly because he had to, partly because sitting alone in the White House was worse. At least in the telegraph office, there was activity, purpose, the illusion that he was doing something, even if that something was just waiting for bad news to arrive faster. The operators later recalled how quiet he was, how he'd read a message, fold it carefully, and set it aside without comment. How sometimes he'd close his eyes and just sit there, not moving, like he was trying to will himself into a different reality, one where the war was over, where the country was whole again, where he didn't have to spend every night reading about boys dying in fields he'd never seen. Lincoln also used the telegraph office as a kind of escape, not from the war, but from the endless stream of people who wanted things from him. Politicians, generals, citizens with complaints or requests or ideas about how to win the war. The White House was always full of people. The telegraph office was quieter, more controlled. The operators didn't ask him for favors. They just did their job. And Lincoln could sit there in the low light of the lamps and think without interruption. He'd sometimes write there too. Draft orders, compose messages to generals, work on speeches. The Emancipation Proclamation was partially drafted in that office, between telegrams about battles and casualty counts. Lincoln would read about death, and then he'd write about freedom. It's hard to imagine that kind of mental compartmentalization. The ability to hold horror and hope in your head at the same time and still function. But that was Lincoln's entire presidency, really. Holding contradictions, managing impossible expectations, trying to save a country that half of itself didn't want to be saved. And the telegraph office was where all of that became most real, where the abstract ideas of union and freedom turned into lists of names, numbers, reports of men freezing to death in winter camps or dying of disease before they ever saw combat. And through it all, Lincoln kept showing up, night after night, year after year, sitting in that small room with the telegraph operators, waiting for news that might never be good, but that he needed to hear anyway. Because if he didn't know what was happening, how could he make decisions? If he didn't sit with the reality of the war, how could he ask anyone else to? It's exhausting just to think about. The weight of it, the relentlessness, the way Lincoln spent 4 years waiting for the war to end, knowing it might outlast him, knowing that even if the Union won, the cost would be almost unbearable. And yet he kept going, kept reading, kept sitting in that telegraph office like it was the only place in the world where truth still existed. Of course, not every president dealt with isolation by seeking information. Some dealt with it by creating things, by obsessively designing and redesigning the world around them, as if perfect furniture could somehow make up for an imperfect reality. Thomas Jefferson, redesigning furniture. Obsessively, Thomas Jefferson was a lot of things. Founding father, author of the Declaration of Independence, third president of the United States, architect, inventor, philosopher, slaveholder, which we'll get to because you can't talk about Jefferson without acknowledging the massive, glaring contradiction at the center of his entire life. But right now we're talking about furniture, because Thomas Jefferson could not stop redesigning furniture, not just buying it, not just arranging it, redesigning it from scratch, over and over again. Like furniture was a puzzle he could solve if he just found the right configuration of wood and nails and hinges. He designed rotating bookcases, adjustable tables, chairs with built-in writing surfaces, a bed that was positioned between 2 rooms so he could wake up and choose which side to get out of depending on his mood, which is either genius or the most extra thing anyone has ever done with a bedroom. Jefferson's home, Monticello, was basically a laboratory for his furniture obsession. Every room had something custom made, something he'd sketched out and had built to his exact specifications. He had a rotating bookstand that could hold 5 books at once, allowing him to read multiple texts simultaneously and compare them without having to get up, which sounds incredibly convenient until you realize it also sounds like the setup for a very specific kind of madness. And it wasn't just about functionality. Jefferson was an aesthete. He cared about how things looked, how they fit together, how the design reflected Enlightenment ideals of reason and order. He wanted his furniture to be beautiful and useful and innovative all at the same time, which is a lot to ask from a chair, but Jefferson was nothing if not ambitious. He'd spend hours sketching designs, revising them, sending detailed instructions to craftsmen, and then, once the furniture was built, he'd use it for a while, find something he didn't like, and start the process all over again. It was never finished, never quite right. There was always some adjustment to be made, some improvement to be implemented, some new idea that required completely rethinking a desk he'd already redesigned 3 times. This obsession extended to architecture, too. Monticello itself was constantly under construction. Jefferson would design an addition, build it, live with it for a few years, and then tear it down and rebuild it differently. The house was never truly complete during his lifetime. It was always in a state of becoming, always one renovation away from perfection, which drove everyone around him absolutely insane, but which Jefferson seemed to find deeply satisfying. There's something almost compulsive about it, the need to constantly tinker, to improve, to control every detail of his physical environment, and you have to wonder what he was trying to fix, because it wasn't just furniture, it was everything. Jefferson was a man who believed deeply in reason, order, and progress. He thought you could design a perfect society if you just applied enough logic and intelligence to the problem. He wrote about freedom and equality with one hand, while enslaving over 600 people over the course of his lifetime with the other. And that's the thing about Jefferson you can't ignore. For all his genius, for all his innovation, for all his beautiful furniture and architectural achievements, he built his entire life on the labor of enslaved people, including Sally Hemings, a woman he enslaved, and with whom he had at least 6 children. People who were born into slavery because of him. People whose freedom he could have granted with a signature, but didn't. So when you look at all that obsessive redesigning, all that endless tinkering with furniture and buildings and systems, you have to ask, what was he avoiding? What reality was he trying to redesign away? Because you can't create a rotating bookstand that makes slavery okay. You can't design a bed that resolves the fundamental hypocrisy of writing, all men are created equal while owning human beings. And yet Jefferson kept designing, kept building, kept trying to create order in his physical space, even as the moral foundation of his life was rotting from the inside out. The furniture was beautiful, the architecture was stunning, and underneath all of it was a contradiction so enormous that no amount of clever design could hide it. Maybe that's why he never stopped. Maybe the obsessive redesigning wasn't about making things better. Maybe it was about staying busy, staying focused on something he could control. Because if he stopped long enough to really look at what he'd built his life on, he'd have to confront the fact that no amount of genius or innovation or beautiful furniture could make it right. But of course, Jefferson wasn't the only president with contradictions. Some were just better at hiding them. Or at least they thought they were. And at least one of them decided that the best time to uncover someone else's truth was when they were too exhausted to lie. Lyndon B. Johnson held meetings at extremely odd hours. Lyndon Baines. Johnson did not respect the concept of business hours. The 36th President of the United States. a man who became president after John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and then spent the next 5 years trying to reshape the entire country through sheer force of will and an absolutely punishing work schedule that he inflicted on everyone around him. If you worked for LBJ, you didn't work 9 to 5. You worked whenever Johnson decided it was time to work, which could be 3 in the afternoon or 2 in the morning or 6:30 on a Sunday. Time was a suggestion. Sleep was for people who didn't want to pass civil rights legislation. Johnson believed that exhaustion revealed truth, that if you kept people up long enough, kept them talking long enough, kept them in a room arguing about policy until their brains turned to mush, they'd eventually say what they really thought. No filters, no political posturing, just raw honesty born from the desperate desire to go home and sleep. So he'd schedule meetings at midnight, or 4 in the morning, or he'd start a meeting at a normal hour and then just not end it. Keep going. Keep talking. Keep wearing everyone down until they either agreed with him or collapsed from fatigue. And this wasn't just with staff. Johnson did this with senators, congressmen, anyone he needed to convince of something. He'd invite them to the White House or to his ranch in Texas, and then he'd trap them in conversations that lasted hours. He'd talk while they ate, talk while they walked, talk while they sat in his office staring at the clock, wondering if they'd ever see their families again. Johnson was relentless. He didn't stop until he got what he wanted, and what he wanted was usually a vote or a compromise or a promise that you'd support his bill even if you hated every word of it. His staff learned to sleep in shifts, to keep spare clothes at the office, to accept that their personal lives were basically over for the duration of Johnson's presidency. He'd call them at 2 in the morning to discuss policy. He'd summon them to the White House at dawn. He'd hold meetings in the bathroom while he was showering, because why waste time being clean when you could be clean and working simultaneously? And yes, that's real. Johnson was famous for conducting business in the bathroom. He'd be sitting on the toilet, door open, staff standing awkwardly in the doorway while he talked about Vietnam or the Great Society or whatever legislative crisis was happening that day. He had no sense of personal boundaries, no shame, no understanding that maybe some conversations should wait until you're wearing pants. For Johnson, every moment was a potential work moment. Every space was an office. Every person was a resource to be used until they had nothing left to give. There's a story about how Johnson would sometimes wake up his staff in the middle of the night just to talk. Not because there was an emergency, not because something urgent had happened, just because he was awake and thinking, and he wanted someone else to be awake and thinking with him. He'd call an aide at 3 in the morning and start discussing policy like it was the middle of the afternoon. Like time was irrelevant, like sleep was optional, like the entire world should operate on his schedule because his schedule was the only one that mattered, and people put up with it. Partly because he was the president, and you don't really tell the president to call back during normal hours, but also because Johnson had this way of making you feel like you were part of something important, like the late nights and the exhaustion and the complete destruction of your circadian rhythm were all in service of something bigger. He was passing the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, programs that would change millions of lives. So yeah, you were tired. Yeah, you wanted to go home, but you were also helping to reshape America. And Johnson made sure you knew it. But here's the darker side. Johnson used exhaustion as a weapon. He knew that tired people made mistakes, said things they shouldn't say, agreed to things they'd regret later, and he exploited that ruthlessly. He'd keep people in meetings until they were so worn down they'd just agree with whatever he proposed because disagreeing required energy they didn't have anymore. It was manipulation disguised as dedication, control disguised as collaboration. His wife, Lady Bird Johnson, once said that Lyndon didn't know how to relax, that he was always working, always thinking, always pushing. And you can hear the exhaustion in that statement. The weight of living with someone who never stops, who can't stop, who treats rest like a personal failing and expects everyone around him to do the same. Johnson also struggled with depression, deep, crippling depression that he hid from the public, but that his staff saw. The late night meetings weren't always about work. Sometimes they were about avoiding being alone with his thoughts, about filling the silence with voices and activity and anything that kept the darkness at bay. He was a man running from something, and he made everyone else run with him. And maybe that's why he worked people so hard. Why he called them at 3 a.m. Why he turned every waking moment into a meeting. Because if he stopped, if he let himself be still for even a second, he'd have to confront whatever it was he was running from. The pressure, the war in Vietnam that was destroying his presidency, the knowledge that no matter how much he accomplished domestically, history might remember him only for the war. So he kept moving, kept working, kept dragging everyone along behind him like exhaustion was patriotic. Of course, not every president used work as an escape. Some found comfort in play, in creating games that made no sense to anyone but themselves, in inventing strange rituals that served no purpose except to fill time and make the weight of the office feel slightly less crushing. Herbert Hoover invented a game. No one else understood Herbert Hoover, the 31st president of the United States, invented a sport. Sort of. It was called Hoover Ball, which is exactly the kind of name you'd expect from a man who was better at engineering than branding. And it was weird. Really weird. Imagine volleyball, but instead of a light, bouncy ball, you're using a 6-pound medicine ball. And instead of gently setting or spiking it over the net, you're hurling this dense sphere of leather and weight at your opponents like you're trying to knock them into next week. That was Hoover Ball. A game that combined the strategy of volleyball with the physical punishment of dodgeball, played by middle-aged men in suits on the White House lawn at 6:30 in the morning. Hoover invented this game in 1929, right after he became president. And his reasoning was actually kind of sound. He needed exercise. The presidency was stressful. He was sitting in meetings all day, making decisions that affected millions of people, dealing with the early tremors of what would become the Great Depression. He needed a way to burn off stress that was more intense than a walk, but less time-consuming than a full workout routine. So he created Hoover Ball, a game that could be played quickly, required multiple people so it doubled as team building, and was physically demanding enough that you'd feel like you'd actually done something afterward. He recruited his staff to play, cabinet members, advisors, military officers, anyone who worked at the White House and looked reasonably fit. And every morning at exactly 6:30, they'd gather on the lawn and throw a 6-pound ball at each other for an hour, rain or shine, hot or cold. Hoover Ball happened. It was mandatory fun, compulsory exercise, the kind of thing where you showed up because the president invented it, and also because if you didn't, someone would definitely notice and possibly judge you for it. The rules were simple but brutal. 2 teams, a net. Throw the ball over the net. The other team has to catch it and throw it back. If the ball hits the ground on your side, the other team gets a point. 1st to 21 wins. Easy enough in theory, exhausting in practice, because catching a 6-pound medicine ball thrown by someone who's trying to win is not a gentle experience. It's like catching a small cannonball. Your arms hurt, your chest hurts, everything hurts. But you keep playing because this is Hoover Ball. and Hoover is watching, and also you're already here, so you might as well commit. The thing is, Hoover loved it. He genuinely enjoyed this bizarre game he'd created. It gave him structure, routine, a guaranteed hour every morning where he wasn't thinking about the economy or politics or the mounting disasters of his presidency. He was just throwing a ball, catching a ball, moving his body, being part of a team. For someone like Hoover, who was reserved and serious and deeply uncomfortable with small talk, Hoover Ball was perfect. It was social without requiring conversation, competitive without being cutthroat, physical without being violent, even if it sometimes felt like it. And his staff went along with it. Some of them even started to enjoy it. It became part of the White House culture, the Hoover Ball game, a weird morning ritual that connected people who might otherwise never interact. The Secretary of Agriculture throwing a medicine ball at the Secretary of War, advisors sweating through their shirts before breakfast, cabinet meetings where everyone was slightly sore and wondering if they'd pulled something during the 6:30 game. But here's where it gets sad. Hoover invented Hoover Ball in 1929. The stock market crashed in October of that year. The Great Depression began, and suddenly Hoover's presidency wasn't about games on the White House lawn. It was about breadlines, unemployment, desperate families losing everything. Hoover tried to fix it. He really did. He implemented programs. He tried to work with Congress. But nothing was enough. The country spiraled. People blamed him. They built shanty towns out of scrap metal and cardboard and called them Hoovervilles, a bitter joke about a president who seemed out of touch with the suffering happening everywhere. And through it all, Hoover kept playing Hoover Ball. Every morning, 6:30, on the lawn. While the country fell apart, he threw a medicine ball. And you have to wonder what that felt like. Whether those morning games were escape or a reminder of how powerless he was. Whether catching that 6-pound ball was easier than catching an economy in free fall. Whether the routine gave him comfort or just made everything worse by highlighting how normal his life was while everyone else's was collapsing. Hoover Ball never really caught on outside the White House. It was too specific, too weird, too connected to a president who became a symbol of failure, fair or not. After Hoover left office in 1933, the game mostly disappeared. A few colleges played it for a while. Some fitness enthusiasts tried to revive it. But it never became a real sport. It remained what it always was, a strange invention by a president who needed something, anything, to make the weight of his office feel manageable. But Hoover wasn't the only president who struggled with the social demands of the job. Some simply opted out entirely, retreating into silence and solitude, rather than forcing themselves into rooms full of people who expected charm and conversation. Ulysses S. Grant avoided social gatherings entirely. Ulysses S. Grant was a war hero, the general who won the Civil War for the Union, the man who accepted Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865, effectively ending 4 years of brutal conflict. He was disciplined, strategic, relentless on the battlefield, and then he became the 18th President of the United States in 1869. And suddenly, all of those qualities that made him an excellent general made him absolutely miserable at state dinners. Grant hated socializing. Genuinely, deeply hated it. Not in the way most introverts dislike small talk. Grant's aversion to social gatherings was almost phobic. He'd skip events whenever possible, avoid parties, find excuses to leave dinners early. And when he absolutely had to attend something, when there was no diplomatic way out, he'd stand in a corner looking vaguely uncomfortable while everyone else mingled and made conversation and did all the things you're supposed to do at a state function. His wife, Julia Grant, was the opposite. She loved entertaining, loved hosting, loved the social aspects of being First Lady. She'd throw elaborate parties at the White House, invite hundreds of guests, orchestrate entire evenings of music and dancing and diplomatic mingling. And Grant would show up because he had to, and then spend the entire evening looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. People who attended these events would later describe Grant as polite but distant, present but not really there, like a statue that occasionally nodded when someone spoke to him. He wasn't rude. That's important to understand. Grant wasn't intentionally snubbing people or being difficult. He was just profoundly uncomfortable with the performance of social interaction. The small talk, the forced pleasantries, the need to be charming and witty and engaging when all you really want to do is go home and read a book or smoke a cigar in silence. Grant was a man of few words, even in the best circumstances. Put him in a room full of politicians and diplomats and society people expecting brilliant conversation, and he'd shut down completely. There are stories of Grant disappearing from his own parties. Julia would be entertaining guests, orchestrating the evening, making sure everyone was having a wonderful time, and someone would ask where the president was, and the answer would be, no one knows. He was here 5 minutes ago. Now he's gone, probably in his study, possibly in bed. He might have left the White House entirely for all we know. Grant had a remarkable ability to simply vanish from social obligations when the pressure became too much. His staff learned to work around it. They'd schedule fewer public events, keep gatherings small when possible, try to limit the amount of time Grant had to spend making polite conversation with people he'd never meet again. And when those events were unavoidable, they'd position him strategically, put him near people he actually knew, give him specific things to do so he didn't just stand there radiating discomfort. It was like managing a very important, very reluctant party guest who also happened to be running the country. Grant was much more comfortable in small groups. With close friends, people he trusted, he'd spend entire evenings with a handful of advisors, smoking cigars, talking about policy or war stories or nothing in particular. These weren't formal meetings. They were just Grant being himself, relaxed, unguarded, speaking in complete sentences instead of awkward half responses. His closest friends saw a completely different man than the public did. Someone who was actually funny when he felt safe enough to make jokes. Someone who told stories. Someone who wasn't constantly calculating how soon he could politely leave. But even with people he liked, Grant had limits. He needed time alone, real solitude. Hours where no one was asking him questions or expecting him to perform or needing him to be presidential. He'd retreat to his study and just sit there, reading, thinking, existing without the weight of other people's expectations pressing down on him. For Grant, being alone wasn't lonely. It was relief, a chance to reset, to remember who he was when he wasn't being watched. The contrast between Grant the general and Grant the president was stark. On the battlefield, he was decisive, clear. He knew exactly what needed to be done, and he did it without hesitation. He could coordinate massive troop movements, make strategic decisions that affected thousands of lives, stand firm under pressure that would have broken most people, but put him in a receiving line at a White House reception, and he'd freeze. The social calculations required for political life were somehow more difficult than the military calculations required for war. Part of it was probably the authenticity problem. In war, things were clear. The enemy was the enemy. Your goals were defined. Success and failure were measurable. But in Washington social circles, everyone was performing. Everyone had ulterior motives. A friendly conversation might be a political maneuver. A compliment might be manipulation. Grant didn't know how to navigate that kind of ambiguity. He didn't know who to trust, so he trusted almost no one. And that isolation made the social requirements of the presidency even more exhausting. And you have to understand, Grant never wanted to be president. He was drafted into it, essentially. The Republican Party needed a war hero. Someone who could unite the country after the Civil War. Someone whose military credentials were unquestionable. Grant fit the bill. And he felt obligated to serve. He'd spent his entire adult life in service to his country, first in the military, then in the war. How could he say no when they asked him to serve again? So he didn't. He accepted. And then spent 8 years being profoundly uncomfortable in a role that required skills he didn't have and didn't want to develop. His presidency was messy. Scandals plagued his administration. Not because Grant was corrupt, but because he trusted the wrong people. He was loyal to his friends, even when those friends were taking advantage of their positions. He didn't see the manipulation happening around him because he wasn't wired to think that way. Grant was straightforward, honest. He assumed other people were too. And in politics, in Washington, that kind of trust gets exploited. The whiskey ring scandal, the Credit Mobilier scandal, his private secretary involved in tax fraud, his Secretary of War impeached for taking bribes. One after another, people Grant trusted betrayed that trust. And each scandal probably reinforced his instinct to withdraw, to avoid social situations where he might be fooled again, to stick with the small circle of people he knew wouldn't use him. So he'd deal with another scandal, another betrayal, another revelation that someone he trusted had been lying to him. And then he'd skip another dinner, avoid another party, retreat further into himself because the social world had proven again and again that it wasn't safe, that people smiled to your face and then used you. That conversation was often just manipulation with better manners. The irony is that Grant was actually a skilled writer. His memoirs, written at the end of his life, are considered masterpieces of military literature. Clear, precise, honest. Mark Twain published them and they became bestsellers. On paper, Grant could communicate beautifully. He could explain complex military strategies in simple language. He could tell stories that were engaging and insightful. But in person, face to face, with the pressure of immediate response, he shut down. After his presidency ended in 1877, Grant seemed relieved. He traveled, spent time with Julia, visited Europe, and was celebrated as a hero everywhere he went. Interestingly, he was more comfortable at international events than domestic ones. Maybe because the expectations were different. Maybe because he was representing America rather than navigating American politics. Maybe because he could be the war hero again instead of the embattled president. He tried to run for a third term in 1880, but didn't get the nomination. Then he lost all his money in a bad investment scheme. Another betrayal. Another person he trusted who turned out to be running a Ponzi scheme. Grant, who had led armies and served as president, ended up nearly bankrupt because he couldn't see through a con man's smile. He was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1884 and spent the last year of his life racing to finish his autobiography so his family would have financial security after he died. He completed it just days before his death in 1885. And even in those final months, he preferred small gatherings, quiet visits, intimate conversations over grand gestures. He was dying, and he still didn't want a fuss, still didn't want crowds, still just wanted to be left alone with the people he actually cared about. Grant's entire life was a study in the gap between public expectation and private comfort. He was brilliant in war and awkward in peace, confident in battle and uncertain in ballrooms. A man who could lead hundreds of thousands of soldiers but couldn't navigate a dinner party without wanting to escape. And maybe that's the most human thing about him. The reminder that competence in one area doesn't translate to comfort in another. That you can be extraordinary at something and still absolutely terrible at the social performance everyone expects to come naturally. But of course, Grant wasn't the only president who understood the power of carefully managing how people saw him. Some took that management to an entirely different level, treating their public image like a craft that required constant practice and adjustment. Franklin D. Roosevelt practiced smiling in mirrors. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, spent hours in front of mirrors. Not out of vanity. Not because he was particularly concerned with his hair or his clothes or any of the typical reasons people stare at their own reflections. Roosevelt practiced smiling. He practiced facial expressions. He practiced projecting confidence, warmth, strength, reassurance. He studied his own face like it was a tool he needed to master, because in many ways it was. This started long before he became president. In 1921, when Roosevelt was 39 years old, he contracted what was likely polio. The disease left him paralyzed from the waist down. He couldn't walk, couldn't stand without assistance, couldn't do any of the physical things that men of his time and social class were expected to do effortlessly. And Roosevelt knew immediately that this could end his political career before it really began. So he made a choice. He would control how people saw him. He would manage the narrative. He would never, ever let anyone see him as weak or diminished or less than he was before. And part of that control was his face. Roosevelt couldn't control his legs, couldn't make them work no matter how hard he tried or how many experimental treatments he pursued. But he could control his expression. He could decide what emotions showed on his face. He could craft the exact impression he wanted to give. So he practiced in mirrors for hours, perfecting the smile that would become his trademark. The one that radiated confidence even when everything around him was falling apart. The smile was important. It had to be warm but not weak. Confident but not arrogant. Reassuring but not condescending. It had to make people feel like everything was going to be okay, even in the middle of the Great Depression when nothing was okay and millions of people were out of work and losing their homes and wondering if the entire American experiment was about to collapse. Roosevelt's smile became a promise, a visual representation of hope. And he practiced it until it was perfect. But it wasn't just the smile. Roosevelt practiced everything. The angle of his head when he spoke, the way he held his shoulders, the gestures he made with his hands. He understood instinctively that politics was theater, that people responded to what they saw as much as what they heard, that if he looked strong and confident and in control, people would believe he was strong and confident and in control, even if the reality was more complicated. And the reality was always more complicated. Roosevelt was in constant pain. The braces he wore to stand and walk were heavy, uncomfortable, and difficult to maneuver. Each brace weighed about 7 pounds. They locked at the knee and extended from his hips to his shoes. To walk, Roosevelt would lock his legs, grip someone's arm, and swing his body forward using his torso and upper body strength. Every public appearance required careful planning. His staff would bring him into rooms early, position him at podiums or behind desks before anyone arrived, so no one would see him being helped or struggling. The press cooperated. There was an unspoken agreement that photographers wouldn't take pictures of Roosevelt in his wheelchair, or being carried, or showing any sign of his disability. Out of more than 35,000 photographs of Roosevelt in archives, only 2 show him in his wheelchair. This wasn't just courtesy. This was Roosevelt's control. His insistence that the narrative would be what he decided it would be. He worked with reporters, built relationships, made them feel included, and in return, they protected his secret. So he practiced. Every morning, in mirrors, making sure the expression he showed the world was exactly what he wanted them to see. Making sure that when he went on the radio for his fireside chats, his voice carried that same warmth and confidence that his smile did. Making sure that every photograph, every newsreel, every public appearance reinforced the image of a strong leader who had everything under control. Roosevelt also practiced his physical movements obsessively. He'd rehearse standing up, sitting down, turning his body. Simple actions that able-bodied people never think about became choreographed performances. He'd practice with his aides, timing everything, making sure transitions were smooth enough that observers wouldn't notice the difficulty. He became an expert at misdirection, at drawing attention to his face, his hands, his voice, while his body did the hard, painful work of maintaining the illusion of normalcy. And it worked. Roosevelt served 4 terms, more than 12 years as president, led the country through the Great Depression and World War II, changed the fundamental relationship between the federal government and American citizens through the New Deal. He's consistently ranked as one of the greatest presidents in American history. And part of that greatness came from his ability to project exactly what people needed to see, to give them hope when hope was in short supply, to smile in the mirror until that smile became real enough that everyone else believed it. But there was a cost. Roosevelt was performing constantly. Every public moment was managed. Every expression was calculated. Even his famous fireside chats, which felt so intimate and personal, were carefully scripted and rehearsed. He was never just himself in public, never unguarded, never allowed to show weakness or doubt or exhaustion, even though he felt all of those things. The man in the mirror was a construction, a carefully built facade designed to hold up a country that was falling apart. His son, James, once said that his father's smile was his most effective political weapon. But weapons require maintenance. Roosevelt maintained his through constant practice, through discipline that matched any athlete's training regimen, through sheer force of will applied to facial muscles and posture, and the tiny adjustments that made the difference between looking confident and looking desperate. There's something both admirable and tragic about it. Roosevelt understood what his country needed and gave it to them, even when it required hiding fundamental parts of himself, even when it meant turning every waking moment into a performance, even when it meant standing in front of mirrors, adjusting his expression degree by degree until he found the exact configuration of hope that people needed to see. And maybe that's what leadership required in that moment. Maybe Roosevelt understood that people needed someone who seemed unshakable, even if that person didn't exist. So he created that person, practiced him into existence, stood in front of mirrors and built a president out of facial expressions, and carefully managed public appearances and a smile that promised everything would be all right. The practice never stopped. Right up until his death in 1945, Roosevelt was managing his image, controlling the narrative, making sure that what people saw was what he wanted them to see. His last photographs show him looking exhausted, aged beyond his 63 years, but his expression is still controlled, still projecting confidence, still that practiced smile, even when there was almost nothing left behind it. Of course, not every president built their private world through external projection. Some went inward in stranger ways. Some found comfort not in controlling how others saw them, but in having conversations with people who weren't there at all. Richard Nixon, talked to portraits. Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, had conversations with dead people. Not literally. He wasn't conducting seances in the Oval Office or claiming to channel spirits. But late at night, when the White House was quiet and the weight of the presidency pressed down like a physical thing, Nixon would walk through the halls and talk to portraits of former presidents out loud, like they could hear him, like they might answer back. This wasn't something Nixon advertised. It wasn't part of his public persona. But people who worked in the White House late at night would hear him, his voice echoing through empty corridors, talking to paintings, having one-sided conversations with Abraham Lincoln, with Woodrow Wilson, with Theodore Roosevelt, with men who'd faced their own crises and survived them or hadn't, and whose painted faces now watched from the walls as Nixon tried to figure out how to survive his own. And you have to understand the context. Nixon's presidency was unraveling. The Watergate scandal was consuming everything. What started as a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in 1972 had metastasized into a constitutional crisis. Congressional investigations, special prosecutors, the slow, grinding revelation that Nixon had been involved in covering up the crime, that he'd lied, that the tapes he'd secretly recorded in the Oval Office contained evidence of obstruction of justice, that his presidency was ending, not with victory or even defeat, but with disgrace. So Nixon talked to portraits. He'd stand in front of Lincoln and ask questions, not out loud questions with question marks, but observations, statements, thoughts he needed to externalize, but couldn't share with living people because he didn't trust anyone anymore. How did you handle the pressure? How did you make impossible decisions? How did you keep going when everyone wanted you to fail? The portraits, of course, didn't answer. They just stared back with their painted eyes, frozen in whatever expression the artist had given them decades or centuries ago. Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State, later wrote about finding Nixon in the Lincoln sitting room, kneeling, talking to Lincoln's portrait. Kissinger described it as a moment of profound vulnerability. Nixon on his knees, addressing a painting, seeking guidance or comfort or validation from a president who'd been dead for over a century. It was sad, strange, human in a way that Nixon rarely allowed himself to be in front of other people, because Nixon was always performing, always calculating, always trying to control the narrative the way Roosevelt had, but without Roosevelt's natural charm or ability to make people like him. Nixon knew people didn't like him. He knew he was awkward. He knew his attempts at warmth came across as forced and insincere. So he stopped trying. He became the man everyone accused him of being. Hard, paranoid, vindictive. And then late at night, he'd talk to portraits because portraits couldn't judge him, couldn't leak to the press, couldn't testify before Congress. The loneliness of it is staggering. Nixon was surrounded by people, staff, advisors, Secret Service. The White House was always full of activity, but Nixon was alone, profoundly, crushingly alone. He didn't trust his staff. He suspected everyone of disloyalty, and given how many people eventually testified against him, maybe he was right to be paranoid. But that paranoia isolated him further. He couldn't confide in anyone living, so he confided in the dead. And maybe there's something fitting about that. Nixon had spent his entire career obsessed with history, with how he'd be remembered, with securing his legacy. He'd achieved so much. Opened relations with China, pursued détente with the Soviet Union, created the Environmental Protection Agency, ended the draft. But none of that would matter if Watergate destroyed him. So he stood in front of portraits of historical presidents and wondered if they'd faced anything like this, if they'd felt this trapped, this helpless, this aware that everything was slipping away and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The thing about talking to portraits is that you're really just talking to yourself. The portrait of Lincoln didn't have opinions about Watergate. It was paint on canvas, but by addressing it, Nixon could externalize his thoughts, could hear himself think out loud, could process the impossibility of his situation in a way that felt slightly less crazy than just pacing around talking to himself in an empty room. At least with a portrait, there was the illusion of an audience, the pretense of conversation, even if it was entirely one-sided. Nixon also reportedly talked to the portrait of John F. Kennedy, which is darkly ironic given their history. Kennedy had beaten Nixon in the 1960 presidential election. Nixon always believed that election was stolen, thought the vote counting in Illinois and Texas was fraudulent. He spent years bitter about that loss. And then Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. And Nixon eventually won the presidency in 1968. But even as president, even after achieving what Kennedy had achieved, Nixon still saw Kennedy as a rival, still compared himself to Kennedy, still resented Kennedy's ease with people, his charisma, the way history remembered him despite his flaws. So, what do you say to Kennedy's portrait when your own presidency is collapsing? Do you gloat? Do you ask for advice? Do you admit that even winning wasn't enough, that you're still competing with a dead man and still losing? We don't know what Nixon said. Those conversations stayed private, but the fact that he had them tells you something about where his mind was. How consumed he was by comparison, by legacy, by the desperate need to be remembered as more than just Watergate. As the scandal intensified, the portrait conversations apparently increased. Staff would hear him more frequently, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes early in the morning. Nixon's sleep schedule was erratic. He'd be up at 2 a.m., walking the halls, addressing paintings, looking for answers or absolution or just a way to make sense of what was happening to him. There's also something theatrical about it. Nixon understood that he was living through a history, that people would study this moment, that his conversations, even the ones with portraits, might eventually become part of the narrative. So maybe there was an element of performance even in these private moments. Maybe Nixon was rehearsing his defense, trying out arguments, testing how they sounded when spoken out loud, using the portraits as an audience for a play that only he could see. Nixon's relationship with history was complicated. He'd grown up poor in California, worked his way through law school, clawed his way up through politics, through sheer determination and ruthlessness. He'd been Eisenhower's vice president, lost to Kennedy, lost a race for California governor in 1962, and told the press they wouldn't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Then came back, won the presidency in 1968. He was a survivor, a fighter, someone who refused to stay down no matter how many times he got knocked over. And now all of that was ending. Not because he lost an election, not because his policies failed, but because of a stupid break-in that he didn't even order, that he only tried to cover up. That spiraled into something so much bigger than it should have been. And Nixon stood in front of those portraits, wondering if any of them had faced something similar. If Lincoln had moments where the weight became too much. If Wilson had nights where he questioned everything. If Roosevelt ever looked at his presidency crumbling and wondered if it was worth it. The portraits represented something Nixon desperately wanted. Historical vindication. Those men had been presidents, had faced crises, had made controversial decisions, and time had, in most cases, been kind to them. Their mistakes were footnotes. Their achievements were taught in schools. Nixon wanted that same redemption. wanted future generations to look past Watergate and see what he'd accomplished. But as the evidence mounted and support collapsed, that future seemed less and less likely. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the Washington Post reporters who broke much of the Watergate story, later wrote about the atmosphere in the White House during those final months. They described a president who was increasingly isolated, who drank more, who made late-night phone calls to staff that ranged from lucid to rambling, who seemed to be having conversations with people who weren't there. The portrait talks fit into that pattern. A man unraveling in slow motion, seeking comfort wherever he could find it, even if that comfort came from oil paint and canvas. But mostly, it seems like Nixon was just desperately lonely. He'd pushed away almost everyone who might have helped him. His chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, resigned. His attorney general, John Mitchell, was indicted. One by one, the people Nixon had relied on either left or betrayed him or went to prison. And Nixon was left alone in the White House, the most powerful office in the world, talking to paintings because there was no one left to talk to who wouldn't eventually use his words against him. The irony is that Nixon was actually capable of genuine warmth in private. His daughters loved him. His wife, Pat, despite everything, stood by him. Close friends described him as thoughtful, even kind when the cameras were off. But he couldn't project that publicly, couldn't turn off the defensiveness and paranoia that had served him so well in climbing to power, but that poisoned everything once he got there. So the public saw one Nixon, and the portraits saw another. And maybe that's why he talked to them. They saw him without judgment, without expectation, without the need to perform. The Supreme Court ordered Nixon to release the tapes in July 1974. The evidence was damning. Republican support collapsed. Articles of impeachment moved forward. And on August 8, 1974, Nixon resigned. The first and only president to do so. He gave a farewell address to his staff the next morning. Rambling, emotional, strange. He talked about his mother, about his father, about how he'd never quit before, but he was quitting now. And then he left. Boarded a helicopter on the White House lawn and flew away. And the portrait stayed on the walls, waiting for the next president to move in. Silent witnesses to everything that had happened. Nixon lived another 20 years after resigning. Wrote books, gave interviews, slowly, gradually, partially rehabilitated his reputation. He became an elder statesman on foreign policy, but he never escaped Watergate, never got the historical vindication he'd sought in those late-night conversations with portraits. When he died in 1994, the obituaries led with his resignation, with the scandal, with the tapes, all the foreign policy achievements, all the domestic programs, all the complexity of his presidency reduced to one word: Watergate. And maybe those portraits knew that would happen. Maybe that's why they stayed silent when Nixon talked to them. Because they knew, in whatever way painted presidential portraits can know things, that some mistakes are too big to outrun. That history makes its own judgments. That all the late-night conversations and desperate rationalizations won't change how the story ends. But Nixon wasn't the only president who sought solace in solitary rituals. Some found their release in movement, in walking away their frustrations when staying still became unbearable. Harry S. Truman took long solitary walks to cool down. Harry S. Truman had a temper. The 33rd President of the United States. The man who ordered the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Who fired General Douglas MacArthur at the height of his popularity. Who desegregated the military. Who made decisions that killed hundreds of thousands of people and saved potentially millions more. Truman carried the weight of those decisions every day. And when the pressure built up to the point where he thought he might explode, he walked. Not casual strolls, not leisurely tours of the White House grounds. Truman walked fast, purposefully, sometimes for miles, early in the morning before the city woke up, late at night when everyone else was asleep. He'd leave the White House, sometimes with Secret Service trailing behind him, sometimes trying to lose them, and just walk. Through Washington, D.C., through whatever city he happened to be in, walking until his anger cooled, until his thoughts cleared, until he could go back inside and be presidential again. Truman walked at a pace that most people would consider a light jog, 3 to 4 miles per hour, brisk enough that his security detail had trouble keeping up. He wasn't walking for exercise, though that was a benefit. He was walking to manage his rage, to process the constant frustrations of dealing with Congress, with the press, with world leaders who said one thing and did another, with the impossible burden of being president during the early Cold War when every decision carried nuclear implications. His walks became famous. People in Washington would see the president marching down the street at 6 in the morning, moving like he had somewhere urgent to be, even though he was just walking in circles. Reporters would occasionally spot him and try to ask questions. Truman would usually ignore them or give curt, unhelpful answers. These walks weren't photo opportunities. They weren't press events. They were survival mechanisms, the thing that stood between Truman's temper and the various people he wanted to yell at but couldn't, because you can't just yell at senators or foreign ambassadors, even when they absolutely deserve it. Truman once wrote a letter to a music critic who'd given his daughter Margaret a bad review of her singing performance. The letter was furious, profane, threatened physical violence. The critic had written that Margaret sang flat and couldn't carry a tune, which may have been true, but which sent Truman into an absolute rage. He wrote back that the critic would need medical attention if they ever met. That's a sitting president threatening to beat up a newspaper critic for being mean to his daughter. The letter became public and caused a scandal, but here's the thing. Truman wrote that letter late at night when he couldn't walk, when he was stuck inside with his anger and no outlet for it. If he'd been able to walk, he probably would have cooled down enough to not mail it, because that's what the walks did. They gave Truman distance, time, space between his initial reaction and his eventual response. When he was angry, his instinct was to lash out, to write scathing letters, to call people into his office and tear into them. But he'd learned over years of public service that acting on anger usually made things worse. So he walked instead. He let the fury burn itself out over miles of pavement. Let the repetitive motion of walking calm his nervous system, the way running water calms anxiety. The walks also gave him thinking time. Truman was decisive, famously so. The buck stops here was his motto. He didn't agonize over decisions the way some presidents did. But that decisiveness required clarity. And clarity, for Truman, came from movement. From physical activity that freed up his mind to work through problems without the distractions of the office. He'd walk and think. Process information, consider options. By the time he got back to the White House, he often knew exactly what he needed to do. His Secret Service detail hated these walks. Truman was hard to protect while moving through public streets at dawn. He'd slip out of the White House before they were ready. Walk routes they hadn't secured. Stop and talk to random people, which from a security standpoint was a nightmare. But Truman didn't care. He needed the walks more than he needed the security. The freedom of movement was non-negotiable. If being president meant being trapped inside all the time, he'd go insane. There's something very American about Truman's walks. The image of the president, alone, walking through his own city like a regular person. No motorcade, no ceremony, just a man in a suit moving fast, burning off steam, trying to keep himself sane enough to run the country. It was democratic in a way that modern presidencies aren't. You can't imagine a contemporary president just walking around DC unannounced, but Truman did it regularly. It was part of his routine, part of who he was. The walks were also a connection to his past. Truman had grown up in Independence, Missouri, small town, middle class. His father was a farmer and livestock dealer who lost everything in bad investments. Young Harry worked a series of jobs, helped on the farm, served in World War I as an artillery officer, came back and opened a haberdashery that failed during the recession of 1921. He knew what it was like to struggle, to fail, to have to get up every morning and keep going even when everything felt impossible. And walking had always been part of that. When he was young and broke and trying to figure out his life, he'd walk. When he was a county judge dealing with corrupt political machines in Kansas City, he'd walk. When he was a senator trying to make a name for himself, he'd walk. It was his constant. The thing that stayed the same no matter what else changed. So when he became president, probably the most stressful job in human history, of course he walked. It was the only thing that had ever consistently worked. He walked in Key West, where he'd go to escape Washington. The heat, the humidity, didn't matter. Truman would be out there at dawn, walking the streets of Key West in his suit, sweating through his shirt, moving with purpose. He walked in Independence, Missouri, his hometown, whenever he could get back there. He walked wherever he was, whatever the weather. Walking was his meditation, his therapy, his method for staying balanced in a job that constantly tried to knock him off balance. Other presidents had their vices. Franklin Pierce drank himself into oblivion. Warren Harding had affairs. Richard Nixon would eventually talk to portraits, but Truman walked, which is probably the healthiest coping mechanism any president has ever had, even if it did occasionally result in angry letters to music critics. The decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan haunted Truman for the rest of his life, despite his public statements defending it. He'd made the call. August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima. August 9th, 1945, Nagasaki. Somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people killed instantly or from radiation in the following weeks. Truman said he never lost sleep over it. Said it was necessary to end the war. Saved lives by not invading Japan. But people who knew him well said he walked more after that. That his pace got faster. That he'd be out in the early morning darkness, moving like he was trying to outrun something. 'Cause how do you process that? How do you live with being the only person in history to order nuclear weapons used in war? How do you reconcile that with being Harry Truman from Independence, Missouri, who grew up going to church and believing in right and wrong? You can't. Not really. So you walk, you put one foot in front of the other, and you keep moving, because if you stop, if you let yourself be still for too long, you might have to actually feel the weight of what you've done. The walks continued after his presidency. Truman lived until 1972, nearly 20 years after leaving office, and throughout those years, he walked around Independence, through the streets where he'd grown up, past his old haunts. The walking was how he stayed connected to himself, how he remembered who he was before he became president, before he made the decision to drop atomic bombs, before he carried the weight of history on his shoulders. There's a photograph of Truman from the 1960s. He's elderly, using a cane, but he's still walking, still moving with purpose, still refusing to be still. The temper might have mellowed with age. The responsibilities were gone, but the need to walk remained. It had become part of his identity, the thing that defined him as much as any policy decision or political stance. Truman understood something fundamental about human psychology, that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to stop thinking about it directly, to move your body, to let your unconscious mind work while your conscious mind focuses on the simple task of putting one foot in front of the other. He didn't have access to modern research on exercise and mental health. He just knew instinctively that walking made him feel better, made him think clearer, made him less likely to do something he'd regret. And maybe that's the lesson, that even presidents, even people making world historical decisions, still need basic human outlets for stress and anger. That power doesn't eliminate frustration. That responsibility doesn't make you calm. That sometimes the best thing you can do, whether you're president or not, is leave the building and walk until you can breathe again. Truman's walks were also acts of defiance against the constraints of the office, against the expectations that presidents should be driven everywhere, should never be alone, should always be available and accessible and performing. Truman said no to all of that. He walked, alone, at his own pace, on his own schedule. It was one of the few areas of his life where he had complete control, where no one could tell him what to do or how to do it. And for someone carrying the weight of nuclear decisions and Cold War tensions and domestic political battles, that small piece of autonomy probably meant everything. But of course, not every president found solace in simple physical release. Some needed their coping mechanisms to be more elaborate, more controlled, more obsessively detailed. Some couldn't just walk away their problems. They had to rewrite them over and over until they got the words exactly right. George Washington rewrote his letters repeatedly. George Washington, the first president of the United States, father of the country, the man whose face is literally carved into mountains and printed on currency, was obsessed with how he sounded on paper, not just in official documents or presidential proclamations, in everything. Personal letters to friends, notes to family members, casual correspondence that no one would ever see except the recipient. Washington wrote them, then rewrote them, then rewrote them again. Sometimes 4, 5, 6 drafts of the same letter, searching for the exact right words, the perfect tone, the precise balance between warmth and dignity that would make him seem like the person he wanted to be, rather than the person he feared he actually was. This wasn't about grammar or spelling, though Washington cared about those too. This was about control, about crafting an image through language, about making sure that every single piece of written communication that left his desk reflected the version of George Washington he'd decided the world needed to see. Calm, dignified, above petty concerns, a marble statue in written form. And if achieving that required rewriting a simple thank you note 7 times, then that's what he'd do. We know this because the drafts survived. Washington kept them, filed them away, preserved them alongside the final versions, creating an archive of his own neuroses. Historians can look at these documents today and see the evolution of a single letter. Watch Washington cross out words and replace them with slightly different words that mean almost the same thing. See him adjust the opening, soften the closing, reconsider the middle paragraph, change his mind about a specific phrase, and then change it back again. It's exhausting just to read. Imagine living it. Imagine being George Washington and spending hours on a letter to a friend because you can't stop tweaking it until it's perfect. And here's the thing. This started early, long before he was president, long before he was a general. Young George Washington, in his 20s, was already doing this. Writing and rewriting letters like his life depended on getting the words exactly right, which in a way, it did. Washington wasn't born into the highest levels of Virginia society. His family was respectable, but not wealthy, not powerful, He didn't go to college in England like many Virginia gentlemen did. He didn't have the automatic social standing that came with the right last name or the right connections. Everything Washington achieved, he achieved through careful self presentation, through making people see him as something more than he actually was. So he wrote and rewrote again, because every letter was an opportunity to reinforce the image. Every piece of correspondence was a performance. Washington understood, probably better than any of his contemporaries, that reputation was everything, that how people perceived you determined what you could accomplish, that if you wanted to be taken seriously, you had to act serious, sound serious, write like someone who deserved to be taken seriously, even if you were secretly terrified that you were just a farmer's son from Virginia who got lucky. His letters from the Revolutionary War are particularly revealing. Washington was commanding the Continental Army, fighting the British Empire, trying to hold together an army that was perpetually underfed, undersupplied, and on the verge of falling apart. And in the middle of all that, he was still rewriting his personal correspondence, still obsessing over whether a letter to a fellow officer struck the right tone, still making multiple drafts of messages that, in the grand scheme of fighting a war for independence, probably didn't matter that much. But to Washington, they did matter, because every letter was a chance for someone to misunderstand him, to think less of him, to see him as weak or uncertain or less than the commanding presence he needed to project. So he controlled what he could control. He couldn't control whether his army had shoes or whether Congress would send supplies or whether his troops would desert. But he could control his words. He could make sure that every letter he sent was exactly right, perfectly calibrated, impossible to misinterpret. There's a famous letter Washington wrote to the Continental Congress in 1775, declining payment for his service as commander-in-chief. He'd only accept reimbursement for expenses, he wrote. No salary. This letter exists in multiple drafts. Washington worked on it extensively, trying to strike the right balance between humility and dignity, trying to make it clear that he was serving out of patriotism, not greed, without sounding like he was bragging about his own virtue. The final version is a masterpiece of humble bragging. It makes Washington look noble and self-sacrificing, while also ensuring everyone knew just how noble and self-sacrificing he was being. That didn't happen by accident. That happened through multiple drafts and careful word choice and obsessive revision. And this continued throughout his life. During his presidency, Washington would draft letters to advisors, to foreign leaders, to members of Congress. Then he'd rewrite them. Sometimes Alexander Hamilton would help, suggesting different phrasings, different approaches. But even then, Washington would revise Hamilton's revisions, layer his own edits on top of the edits, fine-tune until the letter sounded exactly right, until it sounded like him, or at least like the version of him he wanted the recipient to see. His personal letters were no different. Washington corresponded regularly with Lafayette, the French general who'd fought alongside him in the Revolutionary War. These were friendly letters, warm, affectionate even, but they still exist in multiple drafts. Washington couldn't just dash off a quick note to a friend. He had to think about how it would sound, how Lafayette would read it, what impression it would create. Even friendship required performance. Even private correspondence needed to be managed. There's something deeply sad about this. The idea that Washington couldn't even write a letter to someone he cared about without obsessively editing it first. That he was so concerned with image, with reputation, with control, that spontaneity was impossible. That every word had to be weighed and measured and approved before it could leave his desk. It suggests a man who was never quite comfortable in his own skin, never quite sure that the real George Washington was good enough. So he had to constantly create a better one through careful writing and rewriting. And maybe that's true. Washington had no biological children, though he raised his wife Martha's children and grandchildren. He was a slaveholder who expressed moral qualms about slavery, but never freed his slaves during his lifetime, only arranging for them to be freed after both he and Martha died. He was celebrated as a hero, but privately struggled with debt and financial anxiety for much of his life. There was always a gap between the public Washington and the private one, between the marble statue and the actual human being. And maybe the obsessive rewriting was his way of managing that gap, of making sure the public version never slipped enough for people to see the cracks underneath. The letters also reveal Washington's deep sensitivity to criticism. Despite his image as stoic and above it all, Washington cared desperately what people thought of him. He read the newspapers, he knew what his critics were saying, and he'd write responses. Draft long, detailed letters defending himself or explaining his position. Then he'd rewrite them, make them less defensive, more dignified. Sometimes he'd decide not to send them at all, but he'd still keep the drafts, still preserve the evidence of his hurt feelings and his careful attempts to manage them through language. There's a draft letter from 1796. When Washington was preparing to leave the presidency, he was writing to a critic who'd accused him of various things, and the first draft is surprisingly emotional, almost raw. You can see Washington's frustration, his anger, his sense of betrayal that after everything he'd done, people were still questioning his motives. But in subsequent drafts, he pulled back, softened the language, made it more measured. By the final version, all the emotion was gone. Just cold, dignified prose that gave away nothing of what Washington actually felt. And that was the point, really. The rewriting wasn't about communication. It was about concealment, about making sure no one saw past the carefully constructed facade. Washington understood that showing emotion, showing vulnerability, showing any hint of the real person underneath the public image was dangerous. People might lose faith in him, might think he was weak, might decide he wasn't the hero they needed him to be. So he rewrote his letters until all the humanity was edited out, until what remained was perfect and polished and completely, utterly controlled. His farewell address, published in 1796 as he prepared to leave the presidency, exists in dozens of drafts. Washington worked on it for months, had Hamilton help, revised Hamilton's drafts, then revised his own revisions of Hamilton's drafts. The document went through so many iterations that it's sometimes hard to tell who wrote what. But the final version, the one that was published, is pure Washington. Dignified, high-minded, full of advice for the young nation, warning against political parties and foreign entanglements, positioning Washington as the wise father figure, offering guidance to his children. And it worked. The farewell address became one of the most important documents in American history. It's still read in the Senate every year on Washington's birthday. It shaped American foreign policy for over a century. It cemented Washington's reputation as the indispensable man, the one leader who could have been king but chose to be a citizen instead. All of that came from careful writing and obsessive rewriting. From Washington's absolute refusal to let anything go out into the world unless it was exactly, perfectly right. But what did it cost him? What did it feel like to live like that? To never be able to just write a letter without overthinking every word? To be so concerned with how you appeared that genuine self-expression became impossible? Washington lived to be 67, dying in 1799 from what was probably a throat infection, made worse by the medical treatments of the time. And in all those years, in all those thousands of letters, how many times did he write something that was truly, authentically himself, without layers of editing and revision and careful image management. How many times did he let someone see the real person instead of the constructed version? Probably not many. Maybe never. Washington had built himself into an icon, and icons don't get to be human. They don't get to be messy or uncertain or spontaneous. They have to be perfect. They have to be what people need them to be. And if maintaining that required rewriting every letter 7 times, spending hours on correspondence that should have taken minutes, never letting anyone see past the facade, then that's the price Washington was willing to pay. The irony is that we remember Washington now largely through myth. Cherry trees, wooden teeth that weren't actually wooden. I cannot tell a lie, stories that probably never happened. The real Washington, the complicated one who owned slaves and struggled with money and obsessively rewrote his letters, has been buried under layers of myth just like he buried himself under layers of revision. The man who spent his entire life carefully controlling his image has been remembered as an image rather than a person. Maybe that's what he wanted. Maybe that was always the goal. To be remembered not as George Washington, the flawed human being, but as George Washington, the perfect founding father. The one who never made mistakes, never showed weakness, never let anyone see the drafts. But the drafts exist. They're in archives, preserved in his own hand. Evidence that the marble statue was actually a man who second-guessed himself and worried about how he sounded and couldn't send a letter without editing it multiple times first. Evidence that perfection, the kind of perfection Washington projected, doesn't just happen. It has to be built. Carefully, obsessively, through endless revision and self-editing and control. And maybe that's the real lesson from Washington's letters. Not that he was perfect, but that he worked incredibly hard to appear perfect. That the image of the dignified, unflappable founding father was a construction, a performance, something he created through discipline and effort and an almost pathological attention to detail. He wasn't born knowing how to be George Washington. He taught himself through writing and rewriting, through constant, exhausting self-monitoring, through never ever letting his guard down. Other presidents would face similar struggles, similar gaps between who they were and who they needed to appear to be. But Washington was the first, the one who set the template, who showed that being president meant being more than yourself, meant crafting a public persona and maintaining it no matter the personal cost. And for Washington, that cost was measured in hours spent rewriting letters, in spontaneity sacrificed for control, in authentic human connection traded for carefully managed correspondence that said exactly what he wanted it to say and nothing more. In his final years after leaving the presidency, Washington retired to Mount Vernon. He still wrote letters, still rewrote them. The habit was too ingrained to break. But there's a sense in some of his later correspondence of exhaustion, of a man who'd spent his entire adult life performing and was tired of it, who wanted to just be himself, but no longer quite knew who that self was, separate from all the layers of revision and self-presentation. He died at Mount Vernon on December 14th, 1799. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "'Tis well." Short, simple, impossible to revise. Maybe that was the point. In the very end, when there was no time for drafts, no opportunity for careful editing, Washington finally said something spontaneous, something that couldn't be managed or controlled or rewritten until it sounded right. Just 2 words, and then silence. The letters remained, boxes of them, drafts and revisions and final versions, a paper trail of a lifetime spent carefully constructing an image, and that image became what we remember. The myth, the monument, George Washington, first president of the United States, who we picture as stern and dignified and impossibly noble, who we imagine as someone who always knew exactly what to say and how to say it, who we assume was born fully formed, a marble statue from the start. But he wasn't. He was a man who rewrote his letters over and over, searching for the right words, trying to sound like someone worth listening to, someone worth following, someone worthy of being called the father of a country. And he found those words through discipline and effort and endless revision. Through refusing to settle for good enough when perfect was possible with just a few more drafts. That's the George Washington we don't talk about much. The one who second-guessed himself, who worried about how he appeared, who couldn't write a simple letter without editing it multiple times. But that's the one who's real. The one who's actually interesting. Not the myth, but the man who built the myth, one carefully revised letter at a time. And in the end, maybe that's more impressive than the myth itself. Anyone can be born perfect. Washington made himself perfect, or at least made himself appear perfect, through sheer determined effort, through never accepting the first draft, through always believing that with just a little more work, a little more revision, he could sound exactly right. Exactly like the person everyone needed him to be, even if that person wasn't quite real, even if that person only existed on paper, in final drafts that had been revised so many times. The original thought was long gone. That was George Washington, the first president, the founding father, the man who couldn't send a letter without rewriting it 7 times first, who built himself into an icon through pure obsessive control over his own words, and who, in doing so, set a precedent that every president after him would struggle with. The burden of being more than yourself, of being what the country needs, even when that requires burying who you actually are under layers of performance and revision and carefully managed public presentation. So the next time you see Washington on a dollar bill, or carved into Mount Vernon, or painted in some heroic pose crossing the Delaware, remember the drafts. Remember the letters rewritten 7 times. Remember the man who couldn't be spontaneous because spontaneity was dangerous. Who couldn't be himself because himself wasn't good enough. Who created the myth of George Washington through sheer force of will and endless, exhausting revision. That's the secret. That's what no one tells you. Being George Washington was work. Hard, constant, never-ending work. And he did it for his entire adult life, until the very end. Until those final 2 words that couldn't be edited or revised or rewritten into something better. Just "'tis well." And then it was over. And that brings us to the end of our strange journey through presidential history. 13 men, 13 private rituals. Some talked to inanimate objects. Some walked until their anger dissolved into miles of pavement. Some rewrote letters obsessively, searching for perfect words that would hide their imperfections. They boxed. They swam naked. They kept enormous wheels of cheese. They practiced smiling in mirrors until the performance became real enough to fool everyone, including maybe themselves. These weren't character flaws. They were survival mechanisms, ways to cope with a job that demanded everything and gave back mostly criticism and loneliness. The most powerful office in the world still belonged to very human beings, men who needed strange, small rituals just to make it through another day of carrying a nation's on their shoulders. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, be grateful you're not responsible for nuclear codes or Civil War casualties or economic depressions. Be grateful your worst habit is probably just doom scrolling before bed, not talking to paintings or keeping livestock-sized dairy products in your living room. Sleep well. And remember, even presidents were just people trying to figure it out. one weird coping mechanism at a time.